Dover, Pennsylvania. Like much of the United States, Dover has become a town divided.
I personally don't believe in Darwin's theory of evolution.
Saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying for us, well, we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
Dover is split between those who accept Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and those who reject it. And that rift between science and scripture nearly destroyed the community. Signs of trouble first appeared after a Dover High School student painted a mural showing the evolution of humans from ape-like ancestors.
It was a lovely piece of artwork, very well done artistically, and it did not offend me in any way.
But some in Dover were offended by the idea that humans and apes are related. And that mural was removed from the classroom and destroyed. Flames soon spread to the local school board. Angry that only Darwin's theory of evolution was being taught, the board required students hear about a controversial idea at odds with Darwin called intelligent design.
To just talk about Darwin to the exclusion of anything else perpetrates a fraud.
But many say intelligent design is the fraud.
Intelligent design is a science stopper.
It makes people stupid.
11 Dover residents sued their school board to keep intelligent design out of the classroom. And almost overnight, Dover was catapulted to the front pages of the nation's newspapers and the front lines in the war on evolution.
Trials tear communities apart. They set neighbor against neighbor. Nobody wants to do this. You do it when you have to.
With Dover split down the middle, a federal court would decide if intelligent design is legitimate science or religion in disguise. And the verdict would have consequences that reach far beyond the classrooms of Dover.
It's about religion, politics, and power.
Up next on Nova, Judgment Day. Intelligent design on trial.
Major funding for NOVA is provided by the following.
In October 2004, a war broke out in the small town of Dover, Pennsylvania.
Today, the teachers in a rural Pennsylvania town became the first in the country required to tell students that evolution is not the only theory.
It started when the Dover Area School Board passed a policy requiring that its high school science classes include a controversial subject called intelligent design. Proponents of intelligent design claim that many features of living organisms are too complex to have evolved entirely through the natural process of evolution, as Charles Darwin proposed. Instead, they claim some aspects of those organisms must have been created, fully formed by a so-called intelligent designer. And advocates contend intelligent design is a bold new scientific theory with the power to overthrow the theory of evolution.
It's scientists debating science based on the evidence, not based on any religious text or authority, and it's clearly, properly the subject of a science class.
It's in fact opening the path of inquiry to new ways of thinking about things.
Evolution by natural selection is a scientific doctrine, then a critique of that doctrine is a legitimate part of science as well.
The Dover School Board demanded that science teachers read their students a 1-minute statement claiming that gaps in the theory of evolution exist, and putting forward intelligent design as an alternative. The statement also directed students to an intelligent design textbook called Of Pandas and People that would be made available. But many Dover residents and an overwhelming number of scientists throughout the country were outraged. They say intelligent design is nothing but religion in disguise, the latest front in the war on evolution.
The goal of intelligent design is to try to re-Christianize American society.
Intelligent design is not anywhere a scientific concept. It's not a field of science. It's not being actively researched by anyone.
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
The stage was set for a battle that would pit friend against friend and neighbor against neighbor.
It was like we shot somebody's dog. I mean, there was a blow-up like you couldn't believe.
This is like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
Before it was over, this battle would land the school board in federal court. No cameras were allowed in the courtroom, so to bring this historic showdown between evolution and intelligent design to light, Nova has dramatized key scenes from court transcripts. It was a 6-week trial in which modern biology was Exhibit A. And hanging in the balance was not just the Dover biology curriculum. The future of science education in America, the separation of church and state, and the very nature of scientific inquiry were all on trial. In Dover, Pennsylvania, the debate over religion and evolution has long been personal.
We live in a community that has a great many fundamentalist churches.
I've never appreciated the fact that my children are being taught to believe in evolution as opposed to creationism.
In the beginning, God created. To me, that's all I need to know.
Located in the southeastern part of the state, about 20 miles from the capital, it's a quiet, rural place, home to about 20,000 people, more than a dozen churches, and one high school. One of the first people in Dover to sense that trouble was brewing was Bertha Spar. She had been teaching science at Dover High School for almost 40 years. In the spring of 2003, she received some disturbing news from the school district's assistant superintendent.
He actually came to my classroom one evening after school and said, "Bert, I think I need to give you a heads up. There is a school board member who is talking about equal time, whether it be 50%, but certainly equal time for creationism, and I think you need to be aware of this." That's when the red flag went up.
Another science teacher, Brian Ream, heard this too.
I'd actually laughed at him because I thought that was the funniest thing I'd heard. I mean, creationism was ruled out as public education in science when I was in junior high school.
When Bertha Spar asked which school board member was interested in creationism being taught alongside evolution, she was told it was a local businessman named Alan Bonsell, who had recently joined the school board.
My family and I have been very blessed here, and I've had family that lived in the Dover area for 100 years, so it was something that to give back, and I thought I could help try to make Dover, the school district a better place.
When Bonsell had questions about how evolution was taught at Dover High School, Bertha Spar and her biology teachers agreed to meet with him.
I had a meeting with some of the science teachers in the high school just to see what they taught or didn't teach in the high school science class.
And creationism really didn't come up at that meeting. It was more, how do we teach evolution? And he seemed very satisfied. He was okay with how we taught, and we thought everything was good, and we went on our merry way.
If you'll recall, he did enlighten us at that time that he did not, wasn't his belief is that evolution was how things came about.
Right, that's correct.
He felt the Earth was not much more than 4,000 years old.
I personally don't believe in Darwin's theory of evolution. I'm a creationist. I make no bones about that.
Creationists, like Bonsell, reject much of modern science in favor of a literal reading of the Bible. They believe the earth is less than 10,000 years old, and that God created everything fully formed, including humans, in just 6 days. Although most mainstream religions made peace with evolution decades ago, many creationists still see evolution as incompatible with their faith. And both creationism and evolution are no strangers to the court. Their legal battles stretch back to the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925.
Now, as I told you yesterday, Darwin's theory tells us that man evolved from a lower order of animals.
In that case, a high school science teacher in Tennessee named John Scopes was accused of violating state law by teaching evolution.
I hereby place you under arrest.
Loosely portrayed in the classic film Inherit the Wind, the trial turned into a courtroom showdown between legendary lawyer Clarence Darrow.
The defense wishes to place Dr. Keller on the stand so that he can explain to the gentlemen of the jury the exact meaning of the theory of evolution.
And three-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan.
If you had a son, Mr. Sillars, or a daughter, what would you think if that sweet child came home from school and told you that a godless teacher...
Scopes was found guilty of teaching evolution and slapped with a mere $100 fine. But the verdict would have a chilling effect on science education throughout the country for the next 3 decades.
After the Scopes trial, textbook publishers decided that evolution was just too controversial a subject, and so they just quietly removed it from the textbooks. And for most of that time, the textbook was the curriculum. And so if it wasn't in the textbook, it didn't get taught.
The chilling effect of the Scopes trial did not thaw until the 1960s. But as publishers slipped evolution back into their textbooks, creationists fought to teach their views in science class as well. Over the next 30 years, the two sides battled it out in court. The fight culminated in 1987, when the Supreme Court decided that teaching creationism in public school science classes violated the separation of church and state, mandated by the Constitution in the Establishment Clause, which prevents the government from promoting or prohibiting any form of religion. To this day, teaching creationism in public school science classes anywhere in the United States remains a violation of students' constitutional rights. Another Dover School Board member, Bill Buckingham, a retired policeman, was appointed by Alan Bonsell to head the curriculum committee. It was his job to review all requests for new textbooks. The 9th grade biology teachers had asked for a widely used book co-authored by biologists Ken Miller and Joe Levine. But Buckingham did not like what he saw.
In looking at the biology book the teachers wanted, I noticed that it was laced with Darwinism. I think I listed somewhere between 12 and 15 instances where it talked about Darwin's theory of evolution. It wasn't on every page of the book, but like every couple chapters, there was Darwin in your face again. And it was to the exclusion of any other theory.
And at a school board meeting in the summer of 2004, Buckingham made it clear he wasn't comfortable approving that book. The school board put the purchase on hold. So what was it about Charles Darwin's theory that Buckingham objected to? Darwin published his theory of evolution in 1859 in a book called On the Origin of Species, and it has been sparking controversy ever since. It was the culmination of work Darwin started more than 2 decades earlier, after sailing around the world on a ship called the Beagle. On that expedition, Darwin collected thousands of plants and animals that were unlike any he had ever seen before. And when he returned home to England, he became particularly fascinated by the many different birds he had found on a remote chain of islands off the coast of South America called the Galapagos.
There was a bird that looked to him like a warbler, and another one that looked to him like a woodpecker, and another one that looked like a finch, and so forth. And he wasn't sure what these birds were, but they were all clearly adapted for very different ways of life. Some ate insects. Some, for example, picked up small seeds. Some could crush the large seeds of certain plants which were found on the Galapagos. So they had different appearances, different beaks, different styles of life.
When Darwin asked for help identifying these birds, he was in for a surprise.
He was floored, he was stunned to discover that the expert ornithologists in Great Britain told him, they're all finches. That's not a woodpecker, it's a finch. That's not a warbler, it's a finch.
But why, in this small chain of islands, had he found finches with such different characteristics? Darwin reasoned that in nature, individual organisms compete for limited resources, like food. If, for example, a bird is born with a slightly larger beak than the other members of the population, that might give it an advantage on an island where large seeds are more common. Over many generations, birds with large beaks would be more likely to survive and reproduce, handing down this advantageous beak shape to greater numbers of offspring than those with smaller beaks. Darwin called this process natural selection because the forces of nature, such as the environment of an individual island in the Galapagos, select those organisms best suited to that environment. And he believed that over time, this could give rise to new species.
What Darwin pointed out was a general principle, which is easily observed in nature. Species are not fixed. That with natural selection pushing or pulling or splitting, species can change over time.
Darwin thought all the different kinds of plants and animals we see around us today, including humans, could have arisen by this process. He called the gradual evolution of new species from old descent with modification. And he pictured the relatedness of all living things as a great tree of life, with each twig a different species, ultimately springing from a common ancestor.
As you follow the family tree farther and farther back, say from our twig, which we're just one twig on this vast tree, what you see is our similarities with apes, then going further down, our similarities with other mammals, further down, our similarities with reptiles, further down, our similarities with amphibians, fish, all the way down to worms and jellyfish and so forth. What you see is a continuity of life on the planet. That is, we're not exceptional in any great degree. We're just a twig on a giant evolutionary tree that includes everything.
The common ancestry of all forms of life was one of Darwin's great insights, but he recognized disturbing implications in the idea that humans had evolved from ape-like ancestors.
In the eyes of a lot of people, once Charles Darwin had proposed that natural processes could have produced every species on this planet, including us, they felt that took God out of the picture.
And about a century and a half later, many people in Dover, like the United States as a whole, agree.
One more spider, come spider.
To this day, somewhere between a third and half the U.S. population does not accept evolution.
I find it personally offensive because I'm a Christian. I believe the Bible is the inerrant Word of God, and that the book of Genesis tells it like it is as to how we came into being. God didn't create monkey and then take man from a monkey. He created man.
In Dover, hostility to the theory of evolution had already erupted in vandalism. After a Dover high school student painted a 16-foot mural depicting the evolution of humans from ape-like ancestors. The mural was on display in a science classroom when someone removed it from the school and burned it. Now, as Bill Buckingham continued fighting the purchase of the biology book at school board meetings, the science teachers began to suspect that he had been involved.
This idea of man and monkey came into the conversation, and I immediately remember saying to him, does this have anything to do with that mural that disappeared?
And that's when he made the remark that he gleefully watched it burn.
Right. Sort of under his breath, but we heard what he said.
Though Buckingham denied any involvement in the incident, when he reportedly announced he was searching for a biology book that included evolution and creationism, the school board meeting erupted in chaos.
Typically, a school board meeting is a very dry thing. A couple of people show up because they have a certain issue they want to discuss. But these meetings would be hundreds of people, and it would be hot, and people would be upset. It was a zoo. It was just an absolute madhouse.
Ludicrous, bizarre, there's many adjectives I could use. They were disrespectful to the public, disrespectful to the teachers. They didn't want to listen to anybody. They were just on their own agenda.
Sometimes in a democracy, and when you have 9 different personalities together and you have a controversial issue, in the heat of the moment, somebody might say something they wish 10 minutes from now they wouldn't have said.
Bring this meeting back to order.
The controversy engulfing the school board caught the attention of local newspaper reporters, including Lori Lebo, who grew up in the area.
From the first time I heard school board members were talking about creationism, I thought this could become a big issue. I didn't realize how big, but I certainly knew I was intrigued by it.
Lebo began reporting on the controversy, but her interest in the issue was not just professional. It was also personal. Lori's father had been the owner of a local radio station, but the oldies format wasn't paying the bills, and the electric company was about to put him off the air.
The next day, a gentleman came in who belonged to a local church, wanted to lease programming on the radio station, and offered to pay a decent sum of money. And overnight, the radio station became a Christian radio station. My father became born again.
In her articles, Lebo would write about the 1987 Supreme Court ruling that would keep Buckingham from introducing any creationist text into biology class. In the meantime, Buckingham was in touch with 2 organizations known for questioning Darwin. One was a public interest law firm in Michigan called the Thomas More Law Center. Headed by former public prosecutor Richard Thompson, famous for his efforts to convict assisted suicide advocate Jack Kevorkian, the firm bills itself as the sword and shield for people of faith.
Bill Buckingham contacted me as a private citizen and also as someone who was concerned that the biology textbook presented only one side, and he thought there should be other alternative theories involved. And that's when I introduced him to the theory of intelligent design and indicated that I thought that that theory could be taught alongside the theory of evolution and pass constitutional muster.
I asked, if there were any reference books out there, and they gave me the title of the book of Pandas and People.
He also found a conservative think tank in Seattle named the Discovery Institute, which calls itself the nation's leading intelligent design proponent. They sent Buckingham a DVD and other material on intelligent design. In these materials, Buckingham found a view that did not seem to conflict with his own. For example, according to the book of Pandas and People, intelligent design means that various forms of life began abruptly, through an intelligent agency with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks, and wings, etc. And in the DVD he got from the Discovery Institute, Buckingham found more support for intelligent design.
150 years ago, Charles Darwin transformed science with his theory of natural selection. Today, that theory faces a formidable challenge. Intelligent design has sparked both discovery and intense debate over the origin of life on Earth. And for a growing number of scientists, it represents a paradigm, an idea with the power to, once again, redefine the foundations of scientific thought.
Both the DVD and book use the same example to illustrate intelligent design's central tenet, explained here by proponent Steve Fuller.
One way to get into the concept of intelligent design is by imagining what it would be like to run across something like this on a beach. John loves Mary. I mean, this is the sort of design that's very unlikely just to have assembled itself just from sand blowing randomly over even a very long period of time. Rather, it shows a sign of some sort of intelligence that's behind it.
And just as those words on the beach are clearly the product of an intelligent being, the claim is that some aspects of life itself must be the product of a designer.
Intelligent design, in my way of thinking, states that life is too complex to happen at random, that there had to be a designer, something to shape how things went, so to speak. In the book of Genesis, the designer would be God.
But in the materials Buckingham received, God is never mentioned. The designer is called an intelligent cause or intelligent agent. Championed by a law professor named Philip Johnson, intelligent design began to emerge in the 1980s.
This whole Darwinian story, it seems to me, has been very much oversold. Everybody is told that it's absolutely certain and certainly true, and because it's called science, it has been proved again and again by absolutely unquestionable procedures. But this is not true. It's an imaginative story that has been spun on the basis of very little evidence.
An emeritus professor at the UC Berkeley Law School, Johnson wrote a book called Darwin on Trial, in which he laid the groundwork for the intelligent design movement. For years, he's been making the claim that evolution may produce small-scale changes, like the different finch beaks Darwin observed. But for humans to come about requires the intervention of some kind of intelligence.
That is the basic intelligent design proposition, that the unintelligent causes by themselves can't do the whole job. An intelligent cause had to be involved.
Armed with this new information on intelligent design, Bill Buckingham returned to the school board.
He had been told that intelligent design was a good compromise between his religious beliefs, is what he told me, and Alan Bonsall told me that too, and what the courts will allow. They were both very clear on that this is their compromise. Even though they believe in creationism, this would sort of bridge the gap for them.
But the science teachers were not convinced.
The first reading of it, an intelligent agent created life. That's creationism. It's biblical creationism, you know? All I have to do is take out intelligent agent, put in God, and voila, we have the story of Genesis. So there's no question in my mind what intelligent design was.
Now Buckingham was ready to take a stand.
He came up with the ultimatum that the only way that they would vote for the textbooks was that we adopted the Book of Pandas and People as a sister or companion textbook.
But when he put it before the school board, he came up 2 votes short. The board chose to purchase only the standard biology book, co-authored by Ken Miller. Pandas was shelved. That might have been the end of the story. But a few weeks later, 60 copies of Pandas turned up in Bertha Sparr's department, a gift to the school from an anonymous donor. Then, without consulting the teachers, members of Buckingham's curriculum committee drafted the outlines of what became a bold new policy for the science department. It was brought before the full school board for a vote, and after a heated debate, it passed 6-3. In its final form, the policy mandated that all students in 9th grade biology be read a 1-minute statement telling them that Darwin's theory is not a fact, and that it contains gaps. Suggesting intelligent design as an alternative, it directed students to the 60 copies of Pandas that would be available as a reference. The school board members who voted against Buckingham's proposal resigned in protest. Tammy Kitzmiller is the mother of a 9th grade student who would be read the 1-minute statement at Dover High School. She called the ACLU to see what could be done.
I just didn't agree with what they were doing. I did not like how they were trying to mix religion and science.
We had parents, we had students, we had teachers, all calling us and saying, hey, there's a problem here, can you help us? And we said, sure, we'll help you.
On December 14, 2004, 11 parents of Dover school students, including Tammy Kitzmiller and Brian and Christy Ream, filed a lawsuit in federal court in Pennsylvania, alleging the Dover School Board was violating their constitutional rights by introducing religion into science class. They would be represented by the ACLU, which had joined forces with the organization Americans United for Separation of Church and State and Philadelphia law firm Pepper Hamilton.
Eric said at the time, "This is the case I've been waiting for my entire career."
The school board would be represented by the Thomas More Law Center, the firm that had told Bill Buckingham about the Pandas book. A court date was set, and as depositions were being taken, the science teachers took a stand of their own against reading the intelligent design statement.
We stepped up and said, we're not going to read it.
We met together and agreed that as a unit, we would stand together.
I mean, I have principles and standards of my own, and there was no way that I was going to go into a science classroom of mine and make a statement about this so-called intelligent design, knowing full well that it was not science.
They notified the board of their refusal in a memo that proclaimed, "Intelligent design is not science. Intelligent design is not biology. Intelligent design is not an accepted scientific theory." With the teachers refusing to read the one-minute statement, Dover's assistant superintendent walked into 9th grade biology class on January 18, 2005, and read,
"The Pennsylvania academic standards require students to learn about Darwin's theory of evolution and eventually to take a standardized test of which evolution is a part. Because Darwin's theory is a theory, it continues to be tested as new evidence is discovered. The theory is not a fact. Gaps in the theory exist for which there is no evidence. A theory is
On September 26, 2005, almost exactly a year after the school board passed the intelligent design policy, 6 weeks of testimony in the case of Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District got underway in federal court in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Good morning to all of you. Are you prepared to open?
Yes, I am.
You may do so.
My co-counsel and I represent 11 parents who are challenging the Dover Area District School Board's change to its biology curriculum. Dover School Board members announced their interest in the topic of evolution in starkly religious terms. They looked for a book that could provide a religious alternative to evolution, and they found one here in Of Pandas and People. They did everything you would do if you wanted to incorporate a religious topic in a science class and cared nothing about its scientific validity.
Patrick Gillen, Your Honor, on behalf of the defendants in this action, the Dover Area School District and its Board of Directors.
The board believed that intelligent design was not creationism. They knew what that was, the Book of Genesis.
They believed it was a legitimate educational goal to make the students aware of the existence of another scientific theory.
Defendants' experts will show this court that intelligent design theory is science. It is not religion. This expert testimony will also demonstrate that making students aware of gaps and problems in evolutionary theory is good science education. It's good liberal education.
By the time the trial started, challenges to the teaching of evolution had cropped up in dozens of other states, and intelligent design was attracting some heavy hitters. Rick Santorum, then Pennsylvania senator, had commended the school district for its intelligent design policy, and President Bush had thrown his support behind intelligent design, saying both sides ought to be properly taught so people can understand what the debate is about. Now, the eyes of the nation were on Dover, the latest battleground in the war on evolution.
Now, I don't want to sound melodramatic, but I actually think very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
If a school board could do this, what would prevent them from doing more things like this in other classes, presenting pseudoscience or pseudo-math or pseudo-history in promotion of one particular religious view? It's wrong.
Does science education have to be so narrow, so technical, so deferential to the existing paradigm that we can't even introduce students to what may be the next great theory?
Presiding over the case would be Judge John E. Jones III.
I could never have imagined in August of 2002, when I took my seat, that I would be presiding over a case that would attract literally worldwide attention.
Jones had been recommended for his position on the bench by Senator Santorum and appointed by George W. Bush. Before becoming a judge, Jones was head of Pennsylvania's Liquor Control Board, where he banned the sale of Bad Frog beer because it showed a cartoon frog making an offensive gesture.
Initially, you find out you've got a judge that's been appointed by President Bush, who has come out himself in favor of intelligent design. That makes you a little nervous.
Members of the defense, however, were optimistic about their chances in Jones's courtroom.
What the Dover School Board had done, they weren't requiring that intelligent design be taught, and they weren't removing evolution from the classroom. So it seemed to me this was pretty modest, and so I did think it had a pretty good chance, if it was printed properly, of being accepted.
We didn't have to show that, one theory was better than the other, merely that it was a credible theory and that the students would gain something by understanding the controversy surrounding the theory of evolution and the origin of species.
The parents who opposed intelligent design, or plaintiffs, had launched the lawsuit, so the burden of proof was on them. And because the parents were asking for the teaching of intelligent design to be halted, an order that only a judge can render, there would be no jury. Instead, the jury box was packed with reporters and writers from around the globe, including one with a surprising connection to the case.
I think of myself as being a sort of living disproof of evolution, because my great-great-grandfather was Charles Darwin, who was obviously, wrote one of the most important books of the last 2,000 years, and I'm a screenwriter. This is not evolution, in the right direction.
To win, the plaintiff's lawyers would have to show the judge that the Dover School Board's one-minute statement promoted religion or that board members had religious motivation. In addition, both sides asked the judge to rule on a fundamental question: is intelligent design science or not?
In order to show that intelligent design is not science, we had to talk about, well, what is science?
For help, the plaintiffs turned to researcher Nick Motzke and his colleagues at an organization called the National Center for Science Education, which tracks challenges to evolution in public schools.
The last time any lawyer took biology was probably in 9th grade, and I spent months and months on email at meetings explaining science, explaining evolution to the lawyers.
To make their case before a judge who had no particular scientific training, the lawyers for the parents assembled a team of expert witnesses. And as their first witness, they called biologist Ken Miller, co-author of the textbook that Bill Buckingham had called Laced with Darwinism.
Dr. Miller, what is evolution?
Most biologists would describe evolution as the process of change over time that characterizes the natural history of life on this planet.
And what was Darwin's contribution to evolution?
Darwin pointed out that there's a struggle for existence, whether we like to admit it or not. He realized that those organisms that had the characteristics that suited them best in that struggle, those were the ones that would hand those characteristics down to the next generation. And that therefore the average characteristics of a population could change in one direction or another, and they could change quite dramatically. And that's the essential idea of natural selection.
Starting with Ken Miller, the plaintiffs walked Judge Jones through the conflict at the heart of this case. Miller testified how Darwin's theory pictures the history of life as a tree, with species gradually evolving into others over millions of years, producing new branches and twigs, a process that gives rise to all the variety of life, from bacteria to Darwin's finches to ourselves. But intelligent design takes a different view, as the movement's own literature shows. Intelligent design teaches a history of life in which organisms appear abruptly, are unrelated, and linked only by their designer.
What's really being advocated is the idea that organisms poofed into existence through the miraculous act of an intelligent designer, i.e. God. That's the view that intelligent design promotes.
So how can scientists be so sure Darwin's tree accurately represents the history of life on Earth? As it turned out, the latest in a large body of evidence to refute intelligent design and support evolution was coming to light just as this case was unfolding.
I remember thinking to myself when all this was going on, where do they get a load of this? Because it's just so beautiful.
Darwin believed that evidence for his idea of common ancestry would be unearthed in the form of transitional fossils. For example, if, over millions of years, fish gave rise to land animals, as evolutionary theory predicts, we should find fossils of extinct creatures that are part fish and part land animal. In 1999, paleontologist Neil Shubin and his colleagues set out to find just such a creature.
What evolution enables us to do is to make specific predictions about what we should find in the fossil record. The prediction in this case is clear-cut. That is, if we go to rocks of the right age and the rocks of the right type, we should find transitions between two great forms of life, between fish and amphibian.
Many scientists think life began in the water, at least 3.5 billion years ago. More recently, about 375 million years ago, the tree of life branched as primitive fish evolved into amphibians, such as today's frogs and salamanders, which live part of their lives on land. Armed with this prediction, Shubin and his colleagues organized an expedition to one of the most desolate places on Earth, the Canadian Arctic, about 500 miles from the North Pole, where rocks of just the right age are exposed. Here, they hope to fill a gap in the branch of the evolutionary tree that leads from primitive fish to animals with 4 limbs, or tetrapods, by finding a fossil of an animal that shared characteristics of both. But after 3 summers of digging through hundreds of tons of rock in this harsh environment, they had found little of interest. They returned the next year for one last try.
Money was running out. This was it. We were told this was our last year up there. And then in 2004, in the 3rd day of the season, a colleague of mine was removing rock and discovered a little snout sticking out the side of the cliff, just like exactly like this. And he removed more rock and more rock and more rock, and it became clear this was a snout of a flat-headed animal. And that's when we knew, flat-headed animal at 375 million years old, this is going to be something interesting.
They called it Tiktaalik, which means large freshwater fish in the language of the local Inuit people. And it's one of the most vivid transitional fossils ever discovered, showing how land animals evolved from primitive fish.
Over here you have a fish of about 380 million years old. And what you see, just like any good fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You compare that to an amphibian, you find a creature that doesn't have scales, and it's modified the fins to become limbs, arms and legs. And the head's very different. It has a flat head with eyes on top and a neck. What we see when we look at the fossil record, at rocks of just the right age, is a creature like Tiktaalik. Just like a fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You can see the fin webbing here. Yet when you look at the head, you see something very different. You see a very amphibian-like thing with a flat head with eyes on top. It gets even better when we take the fin apart
When we look inside the fin, as in this cast here, what you'll see it as bones that compare to our shoulder, elbow, even parts of wrist, bone for bone. So you have a fish at just the right time in the history of life that has characteristics of amphibians and primitive fish. It's a mix.
And just as evolutionary theory predicts, Tiktaalik suggests a tree of life, with one species giving rise to another over millions of years. The discovery of Tiktaalik was still being written up at the time of the trial, so it couldn't be used as evidence. But Shubin's colleague, paleontologist Kevin Padian, showed the judge examples of other fossils with transitional features that support Darwin's tree of life.
My testimony in the trial was basically taking a day and showing the judge how we do our work and what the evidence is.
How dinosaurs evolved into birds, as seen in creatures like Archaeopteryx, which has a long tail and teeth like a dinosaur, but feathers just like a modern bird. How ancestors of modern reptiles evolved into creatures now extinct that share a common ancestor with mammals. And how surprisingly whales evolved from large land animals that returned to the water.
And where the pandas book says we can't go from A to B, there are no fossils and we don't know how to study them. Actually, we've gone from A to B and to C, D, E, F, and G. We have the fossils, we have the transitional features, we have the ways of analyzing them with many different lines of evidence, and we're looking for the picture that accounts for the most lines of objective evidence.
With each fossil, Padian refuted Panda's claim that different life forms appear suddenly by showing how fossils of extinct organisms bridge the gaps between species, resulting in a picture of gradual evolution, just as Darwin proposed.
The reporters in the courtroom were just amazed that we knew all this stuff, and how come they hadn't learned about this stuff before? And the reason is, it's not in textbooks because the creationists fight so hard to keep it out. That's been a big influence.
The court took a break, and I remember the judge saying something like, biology class adjourned, for lunch. And he was, smiling, and it was clear that we had the judge interested in science.
I'm a professor of integrative biology.
Lawyers for the parents may have impressed the judge and reporters. But many in Dover wondered, why is evolution taught as fact if it's just a theory?
Maybe Darwinism is the prevalent theory out there today, but it is a theory. It isn't a law of science. It isn't, a fact. It is a theory.
We just wanted alternative views talked about too. We weren't saying don't talk about Darwin. Talk about Darwin. It's a theory. But that's what it is. It's not Darwin's law. It's not Darwin's fact. It's Darwin's theory.
To say it's just a theory is really a bit insulting to science, because it holds, in science, a theory holds more weight than just a fact does.
And here I think the term theory needs to be looked at in the way that scientists consider it. A theory is not something we think of in the middle of the night after too much coffee and not enough sleep. That's an idea. A theory in science means a large body of information that's withstood a lot of testing. It probably consists of a number of different hypotheses and many different lines of evidence. Gravitation is a theory that's unlikely to be falsified, even if we saw something fall up. It might make us wonder, but we try to figure out what was happening rather than immediately just dismiss gravitation.
Facts are just the minutiae of science. By themselves, they can be right or wrong. But a theory is something that's been tested and tested over and over again, built on, revised. It continues to be reworked and revised.
Dr. Miller, would you agree that Darwin's theory of evolution is not an absolute truth?
Well, I certainly would, for the very simple reason that no theory in science, no theory is ever regarded as absolute truth. We don't regard atomic theory as truth. We don't regard the germ theory of disease as truth. We don't regard the theory of friction as truth. We regard all of these theories as well-supported, testable explanations that provide natural explanations for natural phenomena.
Should we regard Darwin's theory of evolution as tentative?
we should regard all scientific explanations as being tentative, and that includes the theory of evolution.
Science is about discovering the unknown, what we don't know. I don't focus on what we know as a scientist. I want to find new things that tell me about what I don't know.
As the plaintiffs testified, that quest to investigate the unknown has led to the discovery of some of the strongest evidence for evolution. Darwin was convinced that species evolve over time through natural selection acting on inherited traits. But he had no idea how those traits arose, or how they were passed from generation to generation. When 20th century scientists discovered the role DNA plays in heredity, they founded a new science called genetics that put Darwin's theory to the test. Virtually every cell in every living thing contains chromosomes, which are made of densely packed strands of DNA that function as a blueprint of the individual organism's characteristics. During reproduction, chromosomes from each parent replicate and shuffle their parts to produce new chromosomes. Then each parent passes chromosomes to offspring. But the process is imperfect. Along the way, DNA is subject to random mutations or mistakes, giving each offspring its own unique blueprint. Sometimes this produces characteristics in offspring that are benign. Other times it produces harmful characteristics, like a misshapen wing. But occasionally, the process gives rise to a beneficial trait. For example, a butterfly whose coloration mimics another species that tastes bad to birds. About 100 years after Darwin proposed that natural selection acts on new traits appearing in a population, genetics revealed the biological mechanism that gives rise to those traits in the first place.
And therefore you could say that when modern genetics came into being, everything in Darwin's theory was at risk, could have been overturned if it turned out that genetics contradicted the essential elements of evolutionary theory. But it didn't contradict them. It confirmed them in great detail.
And as Miller would testify, a genetics paper published less than a year before the trial had confirmed what has long been the most inflammatory part of Darwin's theory: the common ancestry of humans and apes. That paper explored a curious discrepancy in our chromosomes. The cells of all great apes, like chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, contain 24 pairs of chromosomes. If humans share a common ancestor with apes, you'd expect us to have the same number. But surprisingly, human cells contain only 23 pairs.
The question is, if evolution is right about this common ancestry idea, where'd the chromosome go? Well, evolution makes a testable prediction. And that is that somewhere in the human genome, we ought to be able to find a piece of Scotch tape holding two chromosomes together, so that our 24 pairs, two of them were pasted together to form just 23. And if we can't find that, then the hypothesis of common ancestry is wrong and evolution is mistaken. Next slide.
To solve this riddle for the court, Miller would show how scientists discovered traces of our evolutionary past buried in the very structure of a chromosome carried by all humans. Typically, on the ends of every chromosome, you should find special genetic markers, or sequences of DNA, called telomeres. And in their middles, you should find different genetic markers called centromeres. But if a mutation occurred in the past, causing two pairs of chromosomes to fuse, we should find evidence in those genetic markers, telomeres not only at the ends of the new chromosome, but also at their middles, and not one, but two centromeres. Finding a structure like this in our chromosomes would explain why humans have one pair fewer than the great apes.
And if we don't find that, then evolution is in trouble. Next slide. Lo and behold, The answer is in chromosome number 2. All of the marks of the fusion of those chromosomes predicted by common descent in evolution, all those marks are present on human chromosome number 2. So the case is closed in a most beautiful way. And that is, the prediction of evolution of common ancestry is fulfilled by that lead pipe evidence that you see here, in terms of tying everything together. That our chromosome, formed by the fusion from our common ancestor, is chromosome number 2. Evolution has made a testable prediction, and it has passed.
So, modern genetics and molecular biology actually support evolutionary theory?
They support it in great detail. And the closer we can get to looking at the details of the human genome, the more powerful that evidence has become.
Darwin didn't even know about molecular biology and DNA, yet that's where some of the most profound evidence is being uncovered today. Think about that. That somebody in the 1800s made predictions that are being confirmed in molecular biology labs today. That's a very profound statement of a very successful theory.
Not a single observation, not a single experimental result has ever emerged in 150 years that contradicts the general outlines of the theory of evolution. Any theory that can stand up to 150 years of contentious testing is a pretty darn good theory, and that's what evolution is.
And the deep understanding of evolution, as proposed by Darwin, has with